Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is award-winning author and former broadcaster Michael Hutchinson. Many will remember Michael from his many years at APTN News, including as the former host of this very show. He is Swampy Cree and a member of the Mississippiwastic Cree Nation in Manitoba. Michael's Mighty Muskrats mystery series for young readers has been praised for its cultural and historical context and young kids' res humor. The fifth novel in the series, The Case of the Pilfered Pin, was released in mid-March. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, man. It's good to be here. And wow, that was quite the intro. I forgot I did some of that stuff.
Although I think we might have messed up. You might have been here longer than 7 years.
I was the host of the news for 7 years, but I also did a few stints as a reporter for APTN Investigates. And yeah, so I was here for, I think, about 9 years. Almost got my tenure.
Nice. Yeah. Almost got that star blanket that probably your family would have made for you, too.
Yeah, I think my sister was making some of them back in the day, my sister Chantel. So, hey, Chantel.
As we mentioned, you were the first host of this show, the creator, we'll call it. How did this show and Laughing Drum come to be?
Well, you know, I think APTN got an influx of money and was looking to create some shows. You know, a lot of people don't know that APTN doesn't necessarily make a lot of shows. They hire contractors, they have partners that create a lot of their fiction stuff. And one of the only shows that APTN makes is the news and its sort of little brothers and sisters. So yeah, I think APTN got some cash and they were looking to create some new shows. And I pitched to APTN Face to Face and APTN Laughing Drum. I was hoping they would pick one, but they picked them both. So I was host of the news and producing two shows at the same time. And yeah, it was a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. It is a grind, though, for sure. That's a lot of work to do. You hosted this show for the first 3 seasons or so. Any of those shows stick out for you?
Well, you know, it's funny. You know, people go to First Nation meetings and say, hey, we're still talking about the same stuff we were talking about before. Well, some of those guests, you know, some of their stuff is still relevant. So, you know, one of my favorite guests, and I have to admit I have a little crush on her, is Val Napoleon, who's a professor at the University of Victoria. And she and I talked about the importance of reviving First Nation law. Like, if First Nations want to push Canadian law off their lands, they need to fill the void, and they need to fill it with modern law. You know, the definition of law is really, the law is the voice of the people. And so revitalizing and creating modern First Nation law that meets the needs of today's people is an act of sovereignty. It is an act of nationhood. And then another person I really liked was Kevin Brownlee. And Kevin is a local archaeologist. He was the head of the Manitoba Museum Archaeology for a while, but he's done some amazing work up north looking at mines. And one of the things that I would like to see, you know, Canada puts, restrictions on First Nations and says that we can't make money, you know, sort of under the Indian Act, tax-free, for industries that we weren't doing at first contact or during traditional times. And so what Kevin has found is that there are mines up north where First Nations were taking ores and trading them. And so I would like to see a court case that brings mining and the trading of ore underneath our Indian Act rights and our treaty rights.
2 great examples of why this is such a great show, and that those aren't things you could talk about in a minute and a half news story. Like, you need a bit of time to do that. You also, in addition to almost a decade here, spent some time at CTV Winnipeg doing the morning show over there. Do you miss TV at all?
I miss the newsroom, I guess you could say. I miss being in the know. You know, newsrooms get filtered a lot of information first. You know, when something happens in a community, it might be APTN News that somebody calls up and says, hey, you know, this is going on. So there's a lot of information going through here, going through other newsrooms. That's cool to know. I don't miss being on TV, though. You know, being famous in Los Angeles might be great, but being famous in Winnipeg, not so much. But you know, you know, I guess in my people's culture, you know, the way to be a good person is to find the talent you were given and then use that talent for the good of your community. And my talent is writing much more than being on TV.
Which we'll get into for sure, but I'm sure you were a big star over at Portage Place Mall when you
Oh
took
yeah,
spins through there.
when the food, all the heads turned when I walked through the food court.
You know, almost 20 years or so as a broadcaster, you obviously still pay attention to the news, but do you feel like Indigenous issues are getting the coverage they deserve? Have you seen changes over that 2 decades plus?
I would say so. You know, there have certainly been changes from when I used to watch the news. You know, I remember Jim Compton, you know, seeing Jim Compton on the news and seeing his braids on the news. That was what made me think I could be a journalist. And, you know, because you didn't see that. You didn't see Indigenous people on TV shows, fictional TV shows, never mind being a reporter on the news. So that was big for me. And, you know, that's changed. And nowadays, you know, I think, you know, there's always been sort of big topics that just weren't talked about when it comes to Indigenous issues. And I still think that those big topics, in a lot of ways, aren't talking about, and we're talking about, you know, the results of them as compared to, you know, the core issue. And so, yeah, it goes up and down. You know, sometimes for a while there, the news a few years ago got really into giving Indigenous people awards. You know, and that's super cool. But at the same time, too, you know, if they're filling the news with positive things, especially when it comes to the mainstream media, APTN News is something a little different. But when it comes to, if they're reporting on positive things, sometimes they're dropping those negative things because there's only going to be one Indigenous story on the news, right? And so it's interesting to see how that plays back and forth.
Always people of our generation, I guess I'll say, we're always mention Jim Compton and his braids. And, and a generation later, people hear a lot of younger journalists say Wab Gijik Rice on TV and his braids. Interesting stuff there. What do you're kind of touching on it, but what do you feel are some of the uncovered stories, underreported stories out there right now?
Well, okay, so I'm going to start right at the beginning because I've explained this before. But okay, so under the Canadian governance system, right, you got a Canadian, if they got a bee in their bonnet, they can go to their mayor who's elected and they can remove if they don't do what they want. They can go to their MLA who's their provincial representative and there's elections and they can remove them if they don't do a good job. Members of Parliament, they're elected and these are the decision makers in the chain of money flow, you know, that feeds Canadian communities. Now, let's go over to the Indian Act. If you look at the Indian Act, you got your mayor, your chief who's elected and can be removed, but you know, they're in a lot of ways beholden to the minister. Then you have your regional director of Indigenous Services Canada. And then you have the Minister of Indian Affairs. And these are the decision makers that affect the flow of First Nation funding. And these guys are unelected by the people they govern. And so democracy is an important thing. Like democracy not only gives the people buy-in on what's being done, but it allows the system to respond to the actual needs of the people, but it's also a check and balance, you know, so that the money is being spent in the right way to actually do something. But also, if there's 3 elected officials on here, they're not going to let this guy get too corrupt or they're going to say something, right? You know, there's a system there. So I would like, you know, at the very least, to vote for my regional director. Or what I would like to see the media do is every time there's a story that involves these decision makers, a lot of times they just go to the minister. And we've had Minister Mark Miller say, you know, I make decisions every day that should be made by somebody who was elected by First Nations, right? Mark Miller said that. Well, I'm paraphrasing. Right. But, you know, these people make decisions. So when there's something on housing, when there's something on emergency response, the media should be going to the regional director and saying, what are your decision makers doing on this? And what happens for the, you know, the media has tried to do this in the past for the public to know, but what happens is the regional directors basically say, oh, you know, I don't make decisions, you know, you have to go to the minister for that. And but they are decision makers, you know. If you read Winston Churchill's book, The History of English-Speaking Peoples, they had 4,000 Brits in India when they were running India at the height of colonialism. And this is India. Imagine how many people that was. Mm-hmm. There are now about 5,000 employees in Indigenous Affairs and Natural Resources Canada. So, what are those people doing if the money is just handed over to First Nations? Well, it isn't just handed to First Nations. These two systems are making decisions.
Well, and just last week we were reporting on the cuts that are expected to come to just Indigenous Services Canada, one of, many ministries, departments that deal with Indigenous peoples. Over 7,000 employees there now, and they're about to potentially cut 1,000 in the coming years. But I will say that, that regional director, trying to get that person nowadays is very tough to do that.
Well, and all the First Nations out there know they've been to meetings with bureaucrats where the bureaucrats say, oh, we're not the decision makers. Well, you might be, you can hand that off, but you're still going back to your boss and telling him what was said and all that kind of stuff. And, there's been so many times where bureaucrats have got my goat, so to speak, because they've said, oh, we're here. Well, why the heck did you come out? Why did you spend all that money to come out to Ottawa to say that you can't make a decision? Anyway.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, we're going to change topics here in a little bit and talk about these books here. Michael, award-winning author as well. We just need to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Michael Hutchinson, former broadcaster and host of this show and award-winning author. And Michael, 5 years ago, you released the first of these books, The Case of Windy Lake, if I recall.
Yes.
Was the first one. You just released the fifth in the series. Can you tell us about the Mighty Muskrats?
Sure. Well, I go to author conventions and stuff, and all the other authors are always saying, oh, I had this character that was in me, I just had to get out, or I had to tell this story that was been bothering me, or this is what happened to my grandma. But me being in media and being in First Nation politics for a long time, I get these questions from Canadians a lot of times about First Nations and First Nation issues. And so what I wanted to do was write a book, not only for First Nation kids to see themselves, but for also young Canadians to learn about the First Nation history and about some of the things. And the one thing about history, is you can know it in your head, but it's something completely different to understanding in your heart how that affects families and how that affects kids, right? And so the Mighty Muskrats are, in a very real way, kids who are going through modern First Nation issues and experiencing them on their reserve. And so each story has a sort of overarching mystery arc. In the case of Windy Lake, an archaeologist in the town goes missing. In the recent book, in the case of the pilfered pin, a pin that had the the very edge of the the reserve described on it has gone missing, right? It said the haylands in the treaty, but nobody knew where the haylands actually went because it was etched on this pin that has gone missing. So the Mighty Muskrats go to find that pin. But through this all, they learn about treaty rights, they learn about, residential schools and all sorts of things. Obviously the cousins,
Windy Lake First Nation, all not real places, not real people,
yes,
but
no fictional First Nation.
Based on your own life, or
or
anybody
of course.
That you have in mind?
Everybody knows that in First Nation families, kids of different ages are squished, put together. They're herded together, and so the teenagers watches the preteens, and the preteens watch the adolescents, and then the kookums watch the babies. So that's what's happening to the Mighty Muskrats. They're being herded together. They're a group of cousins. A Tim sort of represents their physical side. Chickadee and Samuel, they sort of go back and forth between mental and emotional. And then Otter, whose parents were killed in a car crash, was raised by Grandpa, so he knows the most about ceremony and knows the most about bushcraft. So what was the question?
They're based on real people.
Yes, so they're based on my cousins and stuff like that. And Windy Lake is, sort of a mix between my First Nation and their lands surrounding it, as well as my Canadian hometown where I graduated high school, called Lac du Bonnet.
Yeah. We've been talking how your daughters are growing up now, although I've read these books myself, but was there books like this for your daughters as they were growing up?
Well, there were more than when I was a kid. Like, I guess how I got into this whole thing was my dad hated TV. And so for sometimes he would remove the TV for whole seasons. And so we read a lot. And so these are often called First Nation Hardy Boy books. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. But, that's sort of where I got the inspiration from, I guess you could say, to write them. And, I did want to educate. So mysteries are a good way to sort of drip information. And that's why I went with mysteries, yeah.
What is it about children's literature that appealed to you?
Well, I think today's kids, both First Nation and non-First Nation, are a special group, a special generation. Where the ideas of heart and mind and spirit and physical, and the connection between them and the importance of this connection is kids are taught that today that I don't think they were taught as to an extent as they were in previous generations. So, like I said before, getting that history from out of the head into the heart and into understanding. I had an elder say to me once, wisdom's good, but knowledge is better. Knowledge is good, but understanding is best, because even a baby understands. And you can see that joy in a baby's face when they understand something. And, understanding is sort of the air that wisdom travels through. And so I wanted to bring understanding to the younger generation about the Canadian First Nation relationships in the hopes of improving it.
Nice stuff. Have you thought about writing for an older audience?
I do have a couple of scripts or manuscripts. In fact, I had an adult manuscript that was being shopped around, and I had a literary agent, and she was the one who suggested that I enter the contest by Second Story Press. They have a yearly contest for Indigenous writers, and she said, why don't you, and in about 2 months, I wrote The Case of Windy Lake. That's another reason why they're, compared to Hardy Boy books, because they ain't Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. Like, I have pumped these out, 5 years. So they're I think they're well written. They're good enough to get published, but, there's obviously, they're like the Hardy Boy books in that they're paperback novels, I guess you could say.
Well, they very visual for me in my head. I mean, reading the Case of the Missing Auntie when they're at the mall and stuff, I'm like, this is definitely Portage Place Mall Michael's talking about here. You won that competition or whatever it was there, and then you've cranked out 5 of these in 5 years. Did you ever imagine writing the first, that you'd be releasing your 5th now?
I did. I started the book with the idea that they would be Hardy Boy books, and being a first-time author, I thought, well, how can I make certain that they're going to buy a second book? So I kind of sold them on the idea that this is a series, and they basically told me that as long as I'm writing them, they'll publish them. I want to say thank you to Second Story Press. Second Story Press, you can find them online. Second Story Press. They're a feminist publication house, and they publish very few guys, and I'm one of them, so I'm very proud of that.
Nicely done. Like we've kind of mentioned, they touch on contemporary issues like environmental rights and concerns, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, animal rights protesters. Why is it important for you to include those types of things in the books?
Well, it's funny. Like I had a reporter asked me one time from a different, station, who said, "Are you trying to politicize the kids?" Obviously, you can tell I wasn't a First Nation person, and I said, "Well, I'm trying to get the kids to care. I'm trying to get them to care about the world around them, and if getting kids to care about the issues that are going on around them, the environment, the Canadian First Nation relationship, the effect of the land on your culture and your people. If getting kids to care about that sort of stuff is politicizing them, then heck yeah, I'm politicizing them. I want them to care."
Were they joking with that?
No, it was I can't name the station, I guess, but sure. No, they were serious, and it was a young male reporter who thought that I was maybe picking fights with Canadians in writing these books.
Right. Well, we'll talk a bit about that and how I would say you pretty much do the opposite, but we do have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Michael Hutchinson. Stick around. welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is author Michael Hutchinson. And Mike, as an author, also you work as a communications manager for the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center. So you get to speak a lot with youth, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And the talks that you give are a lot about treaty and reconciliation. A topic both topics that I know are very important to you, but why are those important for you to discuss with the youth?
Well, I guess starting at the beginning, I used to work for the Indian Claims Commission, and my job back then was to take their great big lawyerly textbook kind of things that they would do on every specific claim and boil them down so that they were digestible by the general public, I guess you can say, in the little magazine we put out. And so I was lucky enough to learn about the treaty relationship all across Canada and how important it is to creating the true spirit and intent of what First Nations envisioned when they decided to be partners with Canadians in sharing this land. Not giving control away, not becoming subservient, but sharing this land. And like the Mohawk saying of the two vessels going down the river, right? Thank you to the Mohawk teachers who gave me that teaching. That's what it should be, with Canada not jumping in our legal canoe and us not necessarily jumping in their legal canoe. And so, yeah, treaty's important. And when I talk about writing the books to improve the Canadian First Nation relationship, the true spirit and intent of treaties is very important to that.
Well, anybody who's ever followed you on Twitter or anything, I'm sure would recognize that, talking about treaty and reconciliation with adults is sometimes a difficult thing to do.
Be, yeah.
What's the reaction from youth when you talk about, issues that are pretty big?
Well, in some cases there is, there's always the kid that, especially when you're dealing with Canadian classrooms that, have been taught something by their parents and they want to challenge you about things like the non-taxation of First Nations, or, which is an economic sanction against our communities. But it's never presented that way, right? There's a lot of propaganda in Canada, and so puncturing that can be tough sometimes. But, I find the kids are always open to it. And like I said, they understand that link between heart and mind better. And, Canada always professes that it wants to be this beacon of light within the world. Well, if there was a generation that I think could become that beacon of light and try to create a true Canadian First Nation partnership over these lands, I think it is these generations coming up.
Well, if you're politicizing them with your books, no doubt.
Well, that's why I'm aiming young, man. But what they did to us in residential schools, well, that's sort of what I'm reverse.
Right. Mike, there was a lot more we could have talked about. We're out of time, but I do want to shout out that you have returned to the host chair for an initiative that's called Words and Culture, and you're doing the Cree language episodes. So I
think there's 36 episodes. I do the 6 Cree ones. They're spotlighting on languages across the country, put together by Kim Wheeler, funded by Sirius FM. That's how I say it,
Sirius,
right?
yeah.
Sirius FM, and it comes through the Community Radio Fund of Canada. Very proud to be a part of it. Cree is obviously very important to me, but unfortunately, I don't speak my language. It's one of the greatest embarrassments of my life, and so we talked to language warriors about that fact.
So much more we could have talked about. Mike, thanks for being here. We're all out of time for this week's show. We'll see you back here in 7 days.